welcome to the latest episode of Out of Left Field. We are podcasting, as always, from the Gulag Archipelago of Soviet Kanakistan, otherwise known as beautiful Vancouver Island. I am your co-host and producer, Ben. We also have Mac.
Me, Mac, also co-hosting.
And Anthony.
Yep, thanks for tuning in, listeners.
You can follow us on Twitter, at RealUlf. Follow us on SoundCloud. Subscribe, all that stuff. And today we are going to be talking about the coup d'etat in a place in the world that I hold very close to my heart, Bolivia. My boy, Evo Morales, is, currently just landed down in Mexico and is in exile and had to resign due to what is basically a right-wing coup d'etat. And so we have yet another country from the pink tide of Latin America being receded, and yet another defeat for the left. To talk about this, today we are joined live from New York, Ben Norton, a investigative journalist, co-editor of the grayzone.com. That is gray with an A, with the Yankee imperialist spelling of the word gray. Ben, thank you so much for being on the show. How are you doing today?
Wait, when I signed up for this, I didn't know there were two Bens. I don't know if I can do it now. It's going to be so confusing.
That's going to cause some sort of segmentation fault somewhere.
Yeah.
Also, I got to say, you Canadians cannot appropriate our American gulag experience because this proud country, America has 5% of the global population and 25% of the world's prisoners. So we are the ones with gulags. But they're capitalist gulags.
All right, show me to your Siberian cold temperatures then, and we'll come to some kind of an agreement.
What, Alaska? You're talking
Buffalo,
about Alaska?
Buffalo, New York.
All right.
Which is like basically just Canada, but with capitalist gulags.
Right. Canada without healthcare.
So Canada.
Yeah, without healthcare. That's right.
And with all of that money that would be spent on healthcare spent on missiles and prisons.
Hey, well, you got to spend it somewhere, right?
And military coups in Latin America.
Apparently, yet another
Most
one.
important part.
And let me just remind our listeners that this is not the first U.S.-backed coup in Bolivia.
No?
In 1981, there was another military coup where the CIA basically. He actually hired a former SS officer, Klaus Barbie, who was notorious even among Nazis for his cruelty, and he got a band of fascist thugs together and, overthrew the government, and the cocaine kingpins and the military took over the country, ramped up cocaine production to industrial scale, and basically sent airplanes full of it into Miami, where it made its way into the inner cities of America, destroying countless lives. You can read more about that coup in Michael Levine's 1993 book, The Big White Lie. But we're going to be talking about the 2019 coup.
Yeah.
So just for the record, today, what is the date today? The 14th of November?
Correct.
Okay, so obviously things are moving very quickly in Bolivia, so by the time this gets posted, who knows what's going to happen. But Ben, can you give us a rundown on what the fuck is going on in Bolivia and what just happened?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Klaus Barbie. Of course, this is a former Nazi war criminal who specialized in torture for the Gestapo and was later rehabilitated by the CIA in Operation Condor. And Operation Condor, known in Spanish as Plan Condor, is not super well known, even among a lot of people on the left. People will know about the famous September 11th, 1973 CIA coup against Salvador Allende in Chile, the first 9/11 attack. And people might know about, Guatemala and Arbenz in 54, but Operation Condor was the name of the U.S.-backed operation to try to liquidate socialism and communism throughout Latin America during the Cold War using these right-wing puppet regimes. And you're right that just as Operation Gladio was used by NATO countries in Europe, in countries where, fascist and Nazi collaborating forces had previously held power, and then their remnants later on were rehabilitated as kind of sleeper cells by NATO. Similarly, in Latin America, there were a lot of these former Nazis and fascists who fled to Latin America and worked with famously the Southern Cone countries, which were kind of the tip of the spear of Operation Condor in Chile under Pinochet, in Argentina, which had a white supremacist leaning military junta backed by the U.S. And the situation in Bolivia is very similar to that. In many ways, I would argue that we're living through a kind of new Operation Condor. You can see the numerous military coup attempts this year alone against Venezuela, the hybrid warfare, the suffocating embargo. I've spent nearly 5 months in Venezuela this year, and I know Venezuela extremely well. And, what's going on in Bolivia is very similar to the tactics used against Venezuela. And we can talk about why they didn't work in Venezuela. I think, just really quickly, the short reason is that because Evo Morales never really controlled his own military. And we published an article at the Gray Zone about how the leaders of this coup had been trained at the notorious U.S. military School of the Americas, the School of the Assassins, where the U.S. military for decades has trained many of these far-right shock troops and forces throughout Latin America. And, of course, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela came from the military, and Chavismo has a strong base in the military. So, I think that's one of the main reasons that explains why it didn't work in Venezuela. But getting back to Bolivia, it's not unique in the sense that the shock troops, the muscle behind this coup, are also literal fascists. This is not like, people on the left were like, oh, well, they're just fascists. And so literal, actual Nazi saluting fascists. And you mentioned Klaus Barbie. Klaus Barbie was part of a group that was founded after World War II when former Nazi collaborators fled to Latin America, and they created the Bolivian Socialist Phalange, which, like the so-called German National Socialists, was in fact explicitly anti-socialist, committed to murdering socialists across the region, but used this antiquated fascist name. And the Bolivian Socialist Phalange eventually, it was largely based in the major city, the largest city of Bolivia, called Santa Cruz. And in Santa Cruz, they also created a youth wing that is called the Youth Union of Santa Cruz. And the coup leader, Luis Fernando Camacho, the guy this Christian fascist who, when he entered the presidential palace, the Palacio Quemado in Bolivia, the first thing he said is, God has returned to Bolivia. And then the pastor next to him, as they held their Bibles, the pastor declared that Bolivia belongs to Christ. So this Christian fascist, he got his start in this youth union of Santa Cruz, which was backed by the U.S. in an attempt to balkanize and weaken Bolivia, and specifically its natural gas rich and lithium rich regions. And this literal fascist cadre-based youth organization, if you look at their videos, which I posted at the Gray Zone, their own videos, these are not videos made by their opponents. They publicize in a historical documentary they made about themselves. It shows their youth cadre marching down the street in Santa Cruz, doing fascist salutes with their arms at their chest. They also posted a video of some of their youth calling for a protest against Evo, and they concluded the video doing Nazi salutes. So these are actual fascists. And this is the youth wing of a Santa Cruz oligarch group controlled by these right-wing millionaires and, the richest people in the country, many of whom are descendants of European fascists, especially Croatian fascists who were in the Ustasha, the Nazi collaborating force in Croatia, who also played a role in the balkanization of Yugoslavia later on. But those who fled to Bolivia, their children became, the scions of these elite families, like Branko Marinkovic is a figure we can talk about. I'm just trying to lay out some of the main figures here behind this coup. And Camacho and Marinkovic were like the two main fascist muscle forces behind the coup. And both of them are right-wing oligarchs from rich fascist families. So, this is not something unique to Bolivia, unfortunately. This is the same kind of CIA textbook strategy used throughout the Cold War to overthrow and destabilize independent socialist governments, rehabilitating and supporting these fascist forces that just so happen to be cultivated by the land-owning, resource-owning oligarchs who had part of their wealth expropriated by the governing socialist forces, in this case, Evo Morales.
Well, I want to bring everyone up to speed and just make sure that everyone knows the context of kind of who Evo Morales is and what his MAS, Movement Towards Socialism Party, is all about. So before Evo, he was elected first in 2006, and before him, every other president of Bolivia in their entire history was a rich white dude. And this is in a country where two-thirds roughly of Bolivians are indigenous, First Nations people. Their Spanish isn't even their first language for the most part. They're Quechua and Aymara speaking. And, Evo grew up in poverty. I think at least one of his siblings died of starvation and malnutrition. And he was the first indigenous president in a majority indigenous country ever. And so he has, been the president since 2006. And he, Bolivia at the time was the most kind of backwards, impoverished country on the entire continent. And he managed to turn that around, lifted, who knows how many hundreds of thousands, maybe, millions of people out of poverty. He greatly improved even by capitalist standards, improved their economy, improved their GDP. But just for a little more context, I want to note what a divided country Bolivia is, geographically, culturally, linguistically. So most of the indigenous folk live on the western half of the country. The country is basically divided in two by the Andes mountain regions. And the eastern part of the country is primarily where, Santa Cruz is, which is mostly Hispanic, Latin, Spanish speaking, and they are, they're kind of the conservative part of the country. They've had movements, especially when they found a metric fuck ton of petroleum resources in the ground there. They had a independence movement. They wanted to create their own country, and so the country is very divided. So this coup that has happened recently is basically the conservative, as far as I understand it, kind of the conservative right wing Santa Cruz region folk kind of reclaiming power. There was videos of the police officers taking the wapala, the indigenous flag, and cutting it off of their uniforms. Evo Morales made the country kind of officially plurinational, as he called it, so recognizing the Quechua and Aymara and other people and bringing them into the fold, basically. And I can't stress enough how much this right-wing reaction is just rooted in just downright racism towards indigenous people. I think, Anthony, you found a quote from this new self-declared president of Bolivia about satanic ritual something.
Yeah, I did. I would love to just share that, actually. So there was a quote here. It comes back from 2013, and this is from newly self-declared President Janine Áñez Chavez. So she writes, "I dream of a Bolivia free of satanic indigenous rights. The city is not for the Indians who should stay in the highlands or the Chaco." And then there's another quote referred to in your article on Gray Zone from the coup leader Luis Fernando Camacho, which says, "Pachamama will never return to the palace." Pachamama was referring to the Andean Mother Earth spirit. And he continues to say, "Bolivia belongs to Christ." So I guess one of my questions here, kind of a two-part question. First off, what is the intersection here between uprooting indigenous land sovereignty and a role in politics and this new wave of Christian fascism that we're seeing in Bolivia and in other parts of Latin America as well? We can talk about that later. So what are the relation between those two things? And then also, you mentioned in your article that even when Camacho started lapping up international attention quite suddenly out of nowhere, despite that, key portions of his background were omitted, which I take it has a lot to do with this kind of long-standing roots in Christian fascism. So can you talk a little bit about the history of Camacho's activism? I kind of hesitate to even call it activism, as well as how he's pulling the strings of power from behind the scenes.
A few different things to say there. The first thing of all is in some ways this is a new wave, but actually it's not so new. And I think if we go back a few decades and look at another US-backed fascist dictator, Efrain Rios Montt, who is in Guatemala, this is another far-right evangelical Christian fanatic who carried out genocide against the indigenous Maya population in Guatemala. Now, what's interesting about this is that this is the most clear-cut case you can ever have of a convicted war criminal who carried out genocide. He was actually tried on the international stage and convicted of genocide. And the entire time, his genocidal military junta was backed to the hilt by the U.S. government and armed, trained, financed, and the United Nations after did a fact-finding mission independently, and they found that the military junta forces were responsible for something like 90% of civilian deaths, and the Marxist guerrillas were responsible for a few percent of civilian deaths, which, of course, that alone shows how the entire Cold War narrative is completely the opposite, how it was actually the Marxist guerrillas who were protecting civilians and the US-backed fascists who were murdering them. But anyway, the point is that this wave of Christian fascists in Latin America is not new, but what is new is that there is a concerted attempt once again to kind of reimpose them as the supposed presidents. You mentioned Agnes, Jeanine Agnes, who is this Christian fundamentalist, who is the so-called fake president of Bolivia, who was never elected and is completely not in the line of the constitutional descent of power. In fact, the person who should be in power is a young woman from the Movement Towards Socialism party, who is a socialist and a militant of the party who was involved in social movements. And she is the elected president of the Senate and was just trying to enter the Senate on November 13th for the vote to recognize this unelected coup leader as the supposed president, and the police forces behind the coup physically attacked her and blocked her from entering the Senate, of which she was elected the president. So, this is completely fake. She has Agnes has no legitimacy whatsoever. And what was her first act as president? She took a giant, comically large Bible and walked toward the presidential palace and said in front of the international media, because of course every corporate media lackey is just hanging out there filming her, and she says, "Jesus is returning to the palace. The Bible is returning to the palace." So in many ways, I think the best way to think about this is that these are the same kind of far-right theocratic fascist forces that the US and the British Empire before it have cultivated and supported for many decades in the Middle East and South Asia. It's the same kind of tactics that we've seen in numerous CIA, US, NATO-backed coups and these same regime change operations. The difference is that in Bolivia, it wasn't nearly as violent because, as I mentioned earlier, and as you were just discussing, Evo Morales came from social movements and was very much a man of the people. He was himself not even just working class, he was extremely poor and he was from the peasantry. And he came to power through, organizing social movements and the labor movement and then coalescing those social movements in a political force, the political arm being the Movement Towards Socialism party. So when he came to power, he had the support of the masses, but the colonial state institutions that were never really democratized and certainly never, went through some kind of revolutionary process like in Venezuela or Cuba, he was always up against his own state. And that's not a criticism of Evo, because Evo did much more than anyone else could have possibly done. I mean, these people criticizing Evo from their homes in the global north are some of the most narcissistic people on the planet. I mean, they can't even win power, yet alone govern their country for 13 years and transform it. It's really a reflection of the nature of the Bolivian state itself, which for decades was governed by these military juntas. And even when it was partially democratized, the military and police forces that were trained by the US and really functioned as continued vehicles and proxies for imperial power, they were never, that problem was never able to be dealt with, because Evo was what all of these global north people call themselves, democratic socialists. He was the textbook example in every way. Everything Evo did was always purely within the confines of this conventionally defined bourgeois democracy. He always had the democratic mandate of the majority of the voting population. And he was overthrown not because he supposedly overstepped those bourgeois democratic bounds, but rather because he was too successful within the confines of that conventional bourgeois democracy. And capital interests wanted to get access once again to Bolivia's substantial natural gas and lithium reserves, and also just wanted to not destroy, but to rather, land a very heavy blow against a functioning, stable socialist government that was the threat of a good example in their eyes.
Well, speaking of corporate interests, let's talk about lithium for a moment. So you can actually see Tesla's stock price rising in real time with the news out of Bolivia unfolding. So I believe it's in the Salar de Uyuni kind of region where they have like the world's largest lithium reserves. Lithium, of course, is used in batteries for all sorts of electronic devices and, electric cars and whatnot. So Evo did make, some concessions he made quite a few concessions to the capitalist class and international capital, which upset, as far as I understand it, quite a few people on the left in Bolivia. So he wasn't, there were criticisms and opposition to him even on the left. But from what I understand it, he made an agreement with a German company to basically export the lithium in the western regions of Bolivia to this private company, which pissed off a lot of people on the left. So just a couple days, I think, before the coup happened, he backtracked and he decided to nationalize the lithium reserves, and which was kind of like I believe some years ago they actually also nationalized the petrochemicals. I spent about 6 months of my youth backpacking through Bolivia, and I remember seeing big signs placed on all the gas stations of Bolivia in La Paz saying, "This is now the property of the Bolivian people." And so I can't help but think that international capital was none too pleased about his decision to nationalize the lithium reserve. So, to what extent do you think that international capital interests played a role in this coup, specifically as it pertains to the lithium reserves?
Well, the first point is that, Elon Musk finally found a way to raise stocks after just randomly accusing people of being pedophiles. He now knows the secret that if you deal with a PR disaster and you just call some random dude a pedophile, all you have to do is just help the U.S. overthrow an independent sovereign nation and take their lithium.
That's it. Yeah, you just do that.
That's the secret. My next job is going to be a PR manager for Tesla. But
good luck.
When journalism falls through because it's impossible to make money being an anti-imperialist journalist. But anyway, no. But in all seriousness, though, a quick note. I mean, you definitely made the point that Morales he certainly made a lot of concessions, which is true for every leader who's ever been in power on the left. And that's, it's true, absolutely. And it's not to say that there weren't criticisms, but there's a big difference between criticisms or critical support and simply opposition. And it's definitely true that people in Bolivia on the left might have had criticisms, but they still supported him. And that's true for Venezuela as well. But crossing the line into opposition is, of course, where we see these ultra-leftists who were constantly criticizing and opposing Morales ended up objectively on the same side as actual fascists and the empire. But as for lithium, you mentioned that Bolivia has the world's largest known lithium reserves. Lithium mineral experts say it's between 50 to 70% of the world's known lithium reserves, which is insane. I mean, it's one thing to say that Bolivia has the largest. It actually has over half of the world's known lithium reserves. And it would be difficult to overstate the importance of lithium, especially because there's all this discussion now of a Green New Deal, which I'm not opposed to, by the way. I mean, it's true that we do need to fundamentally transform the technological and electrical infrastructure of the entire world away from fossil fuel consumption if we want to survive climate change. That's true. But what's not discussed when we have all this, there's so many like progressive forces in the US and Canada and other countries in the global north talking about the importance of a Green New Deal. What they don't talk about is, okay, where are you going to mine all of the minerals needed to create these renewable sources of energy, like batteries for electric powered cars, like solar panels? You need a lot of lithium among other minerals. And what's interesting is that mining is outsourced to the global south. So a lot of social democrats and progressives in the global north don't even think about it. They're just like, oh, we need renewable energy, as if it can just appear out of nowhere. So and to clarify, I'm not against the Green New Deal, depending on how it's done. I'm not against the concept of Green New Deal at all. I think actually, if it's done correctly, it can be a great thing. But we can't ignore the fact that, for instance, as I've pointed out in some of my reporting, that mining.com, which is one of the major mining industry websites, published an article praising the Green New Deal proposed by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez specifically, and saying that this would be a huge boon for the international mining industry. And of course, where are they going to mine a lot of these minerals? It's in places like Bolivia, also Zimbabwe, by the way, which is a factor behind the coup there. So at the same time, I don't think we should have this kind of economic deterministic worldview that says that that's the factor behind the coup. I think it is a factor, and it's certainly an important one. But I also think, as I said earlier, we can't understate the importance of the threat of a good example. Another example of this would be a country like Haiti. There are people that say maybe Haiti has significant mineral reserves or other potential fossil fuels. I don't know about that. But Haiti has been tortured and just terrorized by the French Empire and by the US Empire for 200 years, ever since overthrowing the yoke of European colonialism and successfully overthrowing slavery for the first time in any country in history. And Haiti has, for the past several months, had a massive uprising against a comprador regime that is basically serves as puppets for the U.S. and global North capital. So, it's also the fact that Bolivia was the threat of a good example. And even the Washington Post published a hilarious story in October before the election, admitting, they said, Bolivia is run by self-declared socialists. Its economy is also, according to these conventional neoliberal capitalist metrics, it's still one of the most successful economies in the region. It has one of the fastest growing economies. It has plummeted poverty. The movement towards socialism government and the presidency of Evo Morales, in just 13 years, he cut poverty overall by 40%, and he cut extreme poverty by 60%. So you said earlier that he raised thousands or perhaps millions. It is literally millions, because there are about 11 million people in Bolivia, and he raised millions of people out of extreme poverty and poverty overall. So yeah, I mean, the minerals and also the natural gas are definitely a factor, as they are in Venezuela. But the real goal, the fundamental goal, is also a political one, which is the US and its right-wing allies, Colombia and Brazil, and of course the capitalist interests they represent, and the right-wing oligarchs and the kind of colonial forces, the neo-colonial forces in the region. They want to destroy socialism. And if you listen to Donald Trump's speech, we should take him at his word. He gave a speech in Miami, and he said, the United States will never be a socialist country. Socialism has failed everywhere. Of course, he didn't mention that socialism has supposedly failed because the US empire and its European imperial allies have spent trillions of dollars and expended millions of lives to crush and drown socialism and communism in oceans of blood. But of course, Trump's rhetoric reflects the ideology of the intelligence services that are overseeing these forces, that they see the threat of a good example of a well-functioning socialist government as not only a threat to the short-term interests of their exploitation of these countries' natural resources, but also a threat to the longevity, the long-term capital interests that govern society.
One thing I wanted to get back to is just sort of what you were mentioning about the mining companies loving the Green New Deal, and how, a lot of these industries have been shipped to the global south and all that. In BC here, we actually have a fairly substantial mining industry still, and stuff like copper. It's not really interesting things like lithium so much. But
so what you mean is you can't get high off of it?
No. Well, maybe.
That's what Musk
know.
is really interested in.
But it's just interesting that, like,
I'm sure there's like some high schooler somewhere who tried to get high off copper and like poison himself or something.
Maybe.
He just wants to one up Joe Rogan. Go back onto his show. Something harder.
Copper poison. Anyway, I was just going to say that the environmentalists who have pushed for both a Green New Deal and like the closing of mines and industries in Canada, where, to be fair, they're not great, but like the environmental and labor rights are better here than they are in other countries, which is exactly why these mining companies want to go to other countries, has sort of resulted in this situation where it's like, if you want to have a Green New Deal and capitalism, it appears that it's going to look like things like the Bolivian coup going forward. Like, you're going to have to do stuff like that.
Well, I mean, yes, but also I just want to remind everyone that trains don't need lithium. Nuclear power doesn't need lithium. There's plenty of alternatives. We can make a Green New Deal without. In fact, I personally think that the notion that electric cars is what's going to stop climate change and traffic problems is nonsense. If you have just as many cars on the road, if they're electric, doesn't matter if they're electric or gas powered, you're still going to have traffic jams. Personally, I think the solution going forward is mass transit, trains. And we can make it work. We don't actually. I think the notion that we just need more solar energy and electric cars is kind of a pipe dream, honestly. Because you're absolutely right. It just means more exploitation of the developing countries.
Oh, no question. I mean, I'm on team abolish cars. I mean,
yes.
You can still have a few, but there are a few major cities that are, including in New York, actually, Manhattan recently banned cars on certain roads, and magically, at least they said magically, they were so surprised, overnight the traffic problems disappeared. Well, yeah, no shit. I mean, when you have, instead of, you can fit how many dozens of people in a bus, or you can have dozens of cars. And not even just from an environmental perspective, or from a logistical planning perspective, it's obvious what's the alternative. But, under capitalism and under liberalism, simply as a hegemonic ideology, they see planning as inherently authoritarian. Oh, you're violating the free will of our citizenry who should have the choice. And it's like, well, no, actually, that is a fundamentally not only just simply a bourgeois understanding of life and society, but it's also just flawed because, okay, fine. So what you mean is that only certain rich people can have the individual choice to do that, where all the other poor people have to take public transport anyway. So yeah, there's no question. And then in terms of transformation of society, look, there's two problems that we're dealing with here. There's a contradiction that it is true that climate change is an existential threat to the planet, and that capitalism is devouring not only, the world economically, but environmentally. And that is a huge, huge problem. And we can't necessarily wait for socialism to solve that issue. I think the two can go hand in hand, and they need to go hand in hand. But at the same time, it's true that we do need to take steps toward cutting carbon emissions, transforming elements of the environmental infrastructure. But at the same time, what are the best ways to do that? Is one of the ways to of doing that, simply exporting all your environmental problems to the global south and pretending like in the global north that it's not an issue. Of course, that's not a solution. And what's interesting is to see that some of the same people who kind of know that are just kind of ignoring it as if it weren't a problem. Specifically, I'm thinking of Naomi Klein, and I'm not turning this into like an hour where I'm just gonna shit talk Naomi Klein the entire time. But she's
our Canadian
I'm not a big
gem,
fan, but like. I mean,
Go on.
Because the reason I said that is I don't want to like change the topic too much, but the point is that she went into this whole thing about petropopulism, where she was basically saying, "Oh well, I oppose the fascist coup in Venezuela, but this is a petropopulist regime." She referred to Maduro and Chavez as petropopulist, which is just like condescending, racist nonsense. And it's like these are countries where. I don't know Bolivia super well, to be honest, but I know Venezuela very well, and I've been many times, and I've spent a lot of time there. And in Venezuela, there is definitely an environmental movement that is an environmental socialist movement that also understands that you can still be responsible with the natural resources that exist in your country. You can still mine them and export them and use them to create revenue, to fund social programs, and at the same time, work toward a more environmentally sustainable society and international order. Bolivia and Venezuela, these so-called petropopulists who were attacked by environmentalist imperialists, frankly, in the global north, they actually are not responsible for the vast majority of global carbon emissions and other environmental problems. It's still the US, Canada, and European nations, and increasingly parts of East Asia, especially Japan, South Korea. They are the ones that are responsible for the vast majority of carbon emissions, trash production, consumption. So until the US actually, and Canada and these other countries actually have, they actually implement some of these policies, I think that a lot of these people who claim to be socialists and environmentalists should really, stay quiet and stop criticizing these so-called petropopulists, because it's extremely condescending, and all it does is, it doesn't help the environmental movement. All it does is objectively help imperialism.
I guess that is the common thread here between sort of whinging on about Naomi Klein and the coup in Bolivia is that, we are in like a global economy that is interrelated, and it is pretty common to see this kind of cognitive dissonance when it comes to like principles that we value here in Canada somehow not being applied in other parts of the country, other parts of the world, rather. And I think another aspect to that is the question of what the hell is democracy, for instance, because the argument here in Canada that from the media is basically that like, well, Morales didn't get a majority of the vote and some weird things with their electoral system happened, question mark.
Yeah, but Trudeau got the majority of the vote,
I know,
obviously.
right? Yeah, because he got, I wish the leader of our country got 40+% of the vote. That would be great, as opposed to mid-30s. Because it was...
Yeah, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton each got less than 25% of the eligible voting population, because 47% of eligible voters didn't participate. That's not considering the millions of people disenfranchised. So it's a ridiculous... I mean, the idea that Evo Morales didn't have a Democratic majority is insane, because getting 47% in the first round of an election is remarkable. Also, Evo Morales is the only president in Bolivia's history in his past 3 terms who ever got more than 50% of the vote in an election.
I want to, let's turn our attention back to South America. So, Lula in Brazil was just recently released from prison on court order, which was amazing to see. And we have, there's a lot, the South America, just like really any other part of the world, is deeply divided between left and right now. We have there's a very strong right-wing backlash to the left-wing governments that have popped up, in the last 15 years in South America. And it, as I mentioned earlier, it seems like the pink tide, as it was called, is kind of receding. because in my view, because these governments probably didn't go far enough and weren't able to consolidate their power enough, and so it kind of left the door open for the right to sneak back in. What do you think is can you comment on the right wing backlash? What do you see the future in South America, Venezuela, Brazil, Bolivia, and elsewhere? What do you see as the future in terms of this deep divide, and how do you think it's going to play out in the coming years?
Well, a few responses. One quick note before we move away from the topic, just on this note of consumption and petropopulism. The final point I wanted to make is that, this narrative also misunderstands the global commodity chain and how it's fundamentally an issue of global North imperial consumption, because you can be like, okay, fine. These global North environmentalists can criticize Venezuela for its oil exports and Bolivia for its lithium and natural gas exports. Okay, fine, whatever. I don't know what they get out of that, but let's say they do that. Okay, but who is consuming the oil, natural gas, and lithium? It's not the Bolivian people, and it's not the Venezuelan people. All that's happening is that these commodities, these natural resources, are being consumed by largely people in the global North. Lithium is being used to create batteries for laptops and phones that are not bought by Bolivians and Venezuelans. They're bought by Americans and Europeans and Japanese, and similarly for other things. I mean, it's similar to the discussion around China. I mean, not to change the subject, but like in China, this is a country where, it's often criticized for its fossil fuel emissions, which, is an issue, although the Chinese government is doing infinitely more to combat that than the US government, which is doing basically nothing. But the thing about Chinese production is that this is Chinese production for export back into imperialist nations where they're consuming the products. So we have to look at the global commodity chain, and we can't criticize Bolivia for simply using its own natural resources, then exporting them, and then using that money to fund social programs when they're not the ones responsible for the consumption, which is actually causing the environmental destruction. So, that's an important thing to keep in mind. Now, back to the question of the pink tide. There's no question whatsoever that the pink tide was overturned, and not entirely, but for the most part, it was overturned through imperialist aggression in collaboration with local oligarchies and elites within Latin America. We have to keep in mind, I'm really glad you stressed that Bolivia is a very divided country. And so too is Venezuela. And so too is Honduras and Ecuador. These are very divided societies. And Brazil, God, extremely, extremely divided. I mean, Brazil is its own, it's like half the continent. I mean, it's its own world. And in the case of the pink tide not going far enough, that is... no leader is perfect, and certainly there are criticisms that even their supporters have. But I also think that saying they didn't go far enough is not necessarily, it's not useful, but it's also not the correct criticism. And I say this because, getting really deep into the Chavista movement and picking the brains of a lot of people, including top level officials, you kind of figure out that it's like, look, revolutionary transformation is really, really damn hard. And it's not necessarily for the lack of will of these leaders that they didn't want to go further. It's that the material conditions in their country simply weren't developed to allow them to go to that next level. And the way the Soviet Union dealt with that is through mass industrialization in a very short amount of time that was very violent. And it worked. It turned Russia from what Lenin called the most backward country in Europe to an industrial powerhouse that broke the back of the Nazi war machine and became the second most important global superpower by the 1940s. So it worked, but at an extreme cost to human life, and also in a way that a lot of these countries in Latin America could never do, because these are still countries that unlike the Russian Empire, still had some kind of industrial base and its own domestic production within the Russian Empire. In Venezuela and Bolivia, they don't have an empire that they can expropriate and that they can turn into, internal markets so they can increase domestic production on their own. It's really hard. I mean, if you've ever been to Cuba, I love Cuba, and everything that Cuba has accomplished has been remarkable, considering Fidel Castro has the honor and history of having more assassination attempts against him than any other person ever. 638 just by the U.S. So, this is a country that, considering the suffocating embargo that still continues, and every year at the United Nations, every country in the world except the U.S. and Israel condemns it. Considering all of those obstacles, it's incredible what Cuba's accomplished. But if you go to Cuba is still not it's still the standard of living is not very high, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, because we were talking about environmentalism, but it's a reflection of the fact that this was a country that always had to rely on its own domestic production and wasn't able to be. I mean, when the Soviet Union existed, it was part of a larger economic chain. But anyway, the point, I'm getting kind of in the weeds here, but the point I'm simply saying is that it's not necessarily that Hugo Chavez didn't want to go further, and that Evo Morales didn't want to go further, and even Rafael Correa in Ecuador. They all are socialists who deeply believe that capitalism is an unjust and inherently contradictory system that must be overthrown and done away with. But when you're working within the confines of a bourgeois democracy, when you're in a partially colonized still country where you actually don't have a developed technological infrastructure, even nationalize something is way harder than you think. I mean, when I was in Venezuela, I was talking to government officials and I was like, well, look, in Venezuela, most of the economy is still private. You nationalize the oil, you nationalize the minerals and gold. So you nationalize much of the natural resources, but still, basically all of the food production in Venezuela is private. I was like, well, why don't you nationalize it? And they said, well, what we actually fear is that we have had a brain drain of engineers and the kind of people, the technocrats who run these kinds of things, and we don't even have the capital and technological abilities actually to be able to do a lot of this production on our own. We actually have to rely on the international market. And in the case of Venezuela, this is a country that still imports a significant chunk of its food. So anyway, I mean, I hit a lot of points there, and this conversation can go in different directions now. But the point is that the pink tide was beaten back, and I'm not going to excuse necessarily some of the mistakes made, and there certainly were. But the main factor was not that the leaders didn't go far enough or they didn't have enough popular support. The main factor was that they were simply overthrown, or in the case of military coups, as in Honduras and Bolivia, and the failed military coups in Venezuela and Ecuador, or the kind of soft coups, the parliamentary coups in Brazil and Paraguay, or simply they just face so much internal sabotage and sanctions that after a while their population just got tired of living under siege and just voted for the right wing.
I'd like to just kind of tug on one of those threads here, and specifically about the divided nature of many of these countries, which we've been talking about, and talking about the kinds of popular movements that we're currently seeing on the ground, or the kinds of reactionary movements that we're seeing on the ground. One of the things that we're hearing a lot in the mainstream imperialist-backed media around the world is this kind of loose conflation of left-wing protesters, pro-democratic protesters, and the majority of right-wing neo-fascistic protesters on the ground in Bolivia. We saw similar situations previously this year and last in Venezuela, to a certain extent, in Nicaragua against Ortega's Sandinista government as well. So I'm having a little bit of difficulty, and I'm wondering if you can help fill some of the gaps, just figuring out who this minority of pro-democratic protesters on the ground are, what the levels of support amongst them for the movement for socialism in Bolivia is, and what some of their critiques are, and how they're kind of clashing in the streets now with these fascist protesters as well.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Bolivia is an extremely divided country, as we've been saying. or it's even better, I'll begin by saying Bolivia is a land of contrasts. but the thing is, it is true that the majority of indigenous communities in Bolivia supported the movement towards socialism and Evo Morales. Although let's not forget that the movement towards socialism is a much bigger party than just Evo. Evo was a leader within it, but there are other leaders. And this attempt to portray him as some kind of wannabe dictator ignores, erases all of those other grassroots leaders. I mean, it's also true at the same time that in some ways, over 13 years and having made some concessions and some mistakes, that there were some people within indigenous communities who were critical of Evo. You mentioned specifically on the issue of lithium. Now, this is definitely a criticism you can make, but again, if we take a step back, it's similar to what I was saying about Venezuela. I was picking the brain of some Bolivian comrades who know this situation much better than I do. And what they were saying is that, yes, it's true that Evo Morales signed this deal with this German private company to help develop the lithium industry inside Bolivia and then export that. And that this German company had a pretty good deal and was actually, getting a pretty high percentage of the cut from Bolivia's lithium. But that's true. At the same time, though, so I was like, well, why didn't he just nationalize it and try to develop it itself? And it's like, that's easier said than done, but think about it. How many Bolivians do you think know how to develop a lithium industry? And this is not, I'm not blaming them for being Bolivians, but it's like, if you're in a country that was colonized for hundreds of years and never was able to go through the kind of imperialist industrialization that global North countries were built on. The US economy was built on hundreds of years of slavery. European economies were built on hundreds of years of imperialist and colonialist exploitation, and they were able to develop their economies in that way. If you're a country that is, you could say a developing economy, or I like the term Michael Parenti uses, an overexploited economy, like in the case of Bolivia, how are you going to make a lithium industry without any history of doing that? It's much easier said than done. And one of the ways of doing that is you begin this kind of public-private partnership, which, as a leftist, I'm not a fan of public-private partnerships, but it's simply a reflection of the material conditions that existed inside Bolivia, much in the same way that in the Russian Revolution, after the Russian Revolution, they declare a period of the new economic plan, right? And, I understand that the NEP has been used, the economic policy, I understand that's been used by, right-wing deviationists many times in history. So it's not necessarily to excuse everything that is done in the name of that, but it's simply a reality. And that it's also a reality that happened with Correa and Ecuador. And in both of these cases, this attempt to build roads, to partially industrialize the country, to connect urban areas to rural areas and transport goods and develop an extractivist industry. In the case of Bolivia with Evo and in the case of Ecuador with Correa, it did lead to some indigenous communities protesting their governments and even siding with the opposition against their governments. Now, maybe did they go too far? I don't know. It's hard to say. This stuff is for people within their own countries to determine. But again, I think this goes back to the contradiction of, should we criticize them for trying to develop their countries and use their natural resources? I don't think we should. And I think that although the final point to make here, just to go back to answer your original question, is that, so while it might be understandable that some indigenous communities and working class folks might have been frustrated in some ways with these governments, still the vast majority of working class organizations, unions, workers' federations, and indigenous communities still stood by the movement towards socialism, still stood by Morales. And whilst it is true that he didn't have the overwhelming support that he had in his first 3 terms, where he was getting over 50% of the vote, he still got 47% of the vote in the first round, which that alone is a reflection of the fact that, he still had the majority of indigenous support. And the people in the streets right now defending Evo Morales, calling for the restoration of the Mas government, that is a testament to the massive grassroots support behind him.
Well, one thing I think that it's crucial to note, like you mentioned the Russian Revolution, and, back then, Lenin and Trotsky themselves were overwhelmingly aware of the fact that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to have a successful socialist revolution in a backwards, unindustrialized, agricultural kind of society, and that, they even viewed the success of the Russian Revolution as contingent upon a socialist revolution occurring in an advanced capitalist country. And to this day...
Specifically Germany.
Yeah, specifically Germany, and they were very close. And I think that until that happens, we're probably going to see repeat after repeat after repeat of the same thing happening. And I'm looking at you, Britain, having an election right now. My boy Jezza. I think that if Labour takes power in the UK, that might actually be something that could turn the tides of this. Now, whether or not there's going to be any, socialist governments left, other than probably Cuba, remains to be seen. But I just think
Venezuela. Venezuela's not going anywhere. I'll tell you that. It's not going anywhere.
That's true. Yeah. And I think that if you had an advanced capitalist country that went socialist, then that would be the linchpin. That would turn the tide. That would be the determining factor of the success of other experiments around the world.
Well, that's I guess that's sort of the bigger question here, and why we care about Bolivia, like as a lefty and all that, like at all, is because the pink tide was not just something happening in South America. It was like a meaningful movement to people around the world, and similar to Britain. I guess I would say that like there's a lot of stuff that goes on internally in these countries that, for the most part, is like up to the people in those countries to figure out whether it's a good idea or not. But I guess the part that interests me is the inspiration these countries provide to other people. It's no accident that like it is called a pink wave because or red wave or whatever the hell you want to call it, like because these movements do inspire each other and build off of each other and hopefully, ideally, learn from each other as well. And if Corbyn gets elected in Britain, I do think there would be a similar sort of return to another like left-wing wave, perhaps through Europe or in Canada or wherever. But that's hopefully something that would happen out of that. Because otherwise, it looks like because I remember in the early 2000s when the coup happened, like against Chavez, like that was a really big deal because up until then, it didn't seem like the left wing had any real momentum behind it anymore anywhere. Like it was sort of just like post Cold War 90s, early 2000s, and then suddenly there's this socialist who's been elected in Venezuela, and then a coup just fell apart fairly quickly, and it did sort of provide a degree of inspiration to a lot of people, including myself.
A quick note on Venezuela. Evo's a bit different because Evo came out of a socialist movement. And I was talking about this earlier, and this interesting contradiction with the military, the question of the military. Evo came at politics through the labor movement and through the indigenous communities and was himself a poor worker. Hugo Chavez was not a socialist at first, unlike Evo. Hugo Chavez was a progressive nationalist who, in the 1990s, through the hellish period of neoliberal suffering after the Caracazo, where there was a massive uprising similar to what's going on in Chile against the neoliberal horrors that were overseen, by the way, by neoliberal economists like Ricardo Hausmann, who is this Harvard economist who is now the main economic advisor for Juan Guaidó, the U.S. puppet leader of the coup regime in the Venezuelan opposition. And Hugo Chavez attempted a military-led uprising against the neoliberal regime in the 1990s and failed, and famously issued a speech that inspired millions across Venezuela and said that we will return. And he did return. He was eventually pardoned and released from prison and ran for office as a progressive nationalist. And he originally was inspired, of course, by Simone Bolivar, hence the Bolivarian Revolution. Simone Bolivar was leader of a bourgeois revolution, similar to like the French Revolution, although this was an anti-colonial revolution. He was the descendants partially of European colonialists, but also he was mestizo, he was mixed with indigenous, and he led a massive uprising to defeat the Spanish army. And, kind of like John Brown, like a race traitor, if you will, against his own colonial brethren, and helped create Gran Colombia, the federation of free Latin American countries. And that was what inspired, at first, Hugo Chavez. He wasn't talking about socialism until 2006. But what happened was that in the 2002 U.S. coup, the Bush administration-backed coup, led by these kind of same forces, that failed because Chavez was not only like Evo extremely popular. That's only one factor that's needed. It was also because the military was large segments of the military were loyal to Chavez and to his Chavista vision, and were themselves Bolivarian. After the coup failed and he was restored by the military, then he began building an alliance with some of the socialist governments, mostly just Cuba in the region, but socialist forces in the region, and began exploring socialism. And by 2006, he gave his famous speech announcing socialism in the 21st century as the new economic ideology of the Bolivarian Revolution. So the reason I went through that long history is because it shows how these socialist movements are heterogeneous, and they're very different from socialist movements in the global north, where, many folks come towards socialism from a socialist perspective, whereas a lot of these movements in Latin America, especially with Hugo Chavez and Venezuela, they come towards socialism from a progressive nationalist perspective, seeking sovereignty and independence for their country. And Bolivia is another good example of that too, because keep in mind, this is called the movement toward socialism. They're not called the Partido Socialista. They're not the Socialist Party. And it was a movement led by indigenous, largely, communities in Bolivia who wanted to seek sovereignty and political representation for their own communities who had been excluded from the political system for the entire modern history of Bolivia. And so they realized that capitalism would not allow them to do that, that only socialism would allow them to do that.
One a question I do want to get in here, sort of a topic I do want to talk about here before we totally run out of time, and I'm not sure how much time we're going to take up on this, but we haven't really talked about it at all, and it's the, what did I say when we were discussing this before? The, quote, white elephant in the room?
Oh, right. The drug trade.
The drug trade in Bolivia. Yeah, I'm really proud of that one myself. I was just wondering what you think, like, how has that impacted a lot of this stuff? Because mining is like, yes, it's the thing that like the newspapers here in this part of the world can talk about at all and be like, business getting back to normal. But also, if you look up like Bolivia, major exports, cocaine is one of them. So I guess I'm just wondering what you think about how that will sort of play out and impact all of this.
Well, it's ridiculous and exaggerated. This idea that Bolivia is the haven for the drug trade is just laughable for anyone who knows the basics about Latin America. I mean, talk about elephants in the room. Let's talk about Colombia, the biggest vehicle for drug trafficking in the entire world. And this is, unfortunately, it's basically just a large colony of the U.S. Hugo Chavez famously referred to Colombia as the Israel of Latin America, which is hilarious. But it's also a very insightful analysis. It showed how Chavez understood how imperialism functions. We can't just look at the drug trade as if it's independent, not only from imperialism as a kind of military system, but as a financial system. And we have to understand that Colombia and also Honduras have become, but have been for many decades, the centers of how the drug trade operates. And the most famous example of that is looking at the dirty wars in Central America in the 1980s, where the CIA was funding the Contras, these fascist death squads in Nicaragua and also El Salvador and other countries, using the drug trade because Congress passed legislation forbidding the U.S. from legally directly arming these groups. So that's an example right there of how, okay, fine, we won't fund them with dollars, instead we'll fund them with drugs. And the idea that Bolivia there is coca production, absolutely, but it's not coca production for cocaine necessarily. It's coca production for a variety of other purposes that Bolivians have been using for thousands of years in traditional lifestyles, chewing on it as a form of mild stimulant like coffee. And the idea that Morales is some kind of narco dictator is just like the most ridiculous talking point it's just pure projection from the right-wing opposition.
I'm so glad you mentioned coca, and I want to just quickly shout out to my boy Evo here, because his background was he was a coca farmer, and that was a big part of the movement towards socialism is the costaleros. And Evo Morales actually took this issue to the United Nations because, his talking point was basically that coca is not cocaine. It is the key ingredient in it, but it has a lot of other uses as well. In fact, it is an extremely effective treatment for asthma. So basically chewing, because Bolivia in the western part of the country is at an extremely high altitude, and people often get altitude sickness just fucking flying into El Alto, and chewing on coca leaves it is very effective at oxygenating the blood. When I was there years ago, a friend that I met there was a severe asthmatic and didn't have a single asthma attack once when he was there, because all he had to do was have a cup of coca tea in the morning and he was good to go for the rest of the day. So Evo, coca, of course, is strictly prohibited under international law and U.S. law from being traded or purchased or exchanged anything because of its relationship to the drug trade. But Evo was trying to lift this ban and help his country's economy so that they could export it. And of course that was not successful. But I just wanted to while we're on the topic of Bolivia, just quick shout out to my boy Evo, and just say coca is not cocaine, and I think they should lift the ban.
Illegal to be traded unless you are the CIA, aka Cocaine Internationalist Association. Yeah.
A good parallel is hemp and marijuana. They're not the same thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, Ben, just as we kind of wrap up here, did you have any final thoughts on the whole Bolivia coup situation and what you think are the perspectives going forward for the Latin American left?
Yeah, the first thing I'll say wrapping up here is that we need to start thinking about Operation Condor. I mentioned that earlier. I think we're going through Operation Condor 2.0 right now. And the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, so they don't have the same kind of global war on communist framework to justify that imperialist aggression. But the same tactics are being used as we're using Operation Condor. And we are seeing a moment of massive uprising. So at the same time, I mentioned how Hugo Chavez did not start as a socialist, and it was in fact the US coup that turned him to the left. So not to get cliche, but the first law of thermodynamics that with force comes an equal response, right? When you do have these attempts at coups and sabotage and assassinations and they fail, that actually ironically can in some ways help embolden and strengthen the left. Although when it does work, it's a complete disaster, as we're seeing in Bolivia. So another way we're seeing that right now is in Mexico, where Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who goes by AMLO, AMLO, he is the first left-wing president in 50 years in Mexico. In fact, he should have been president several years ago when he won the election, but it was stolen from him by the neoliberal Peña Nieto. But AMLO is so popular. He has polls show he has about 70, about 3/4 of the country support him in these public popularity polls, so approval rating. So AMLO he was so popular that they really couldn't steal the election from him because he's such a popular phenomenon. And he actually is moving further to the left. When he first entered office, he ran on a anti-neoliberal platform. He said, famously at his inauguration, he said, "The night of neoliberalism has ended. Now is a time for a new dawn." And he was not talking about socialism, and he still really isn't. But he was, a kind of center-left social democratic leader, which was something new and refreshing in Mexico. But in the past month or two, he's taken a pretty significant turn to the left. Now, when the Trump administration initiated this most recent series of coup attempts in Venezuela on January 23rd, Mexico was one of the countries, it was important, that stood with Venezuela, but was a mediator with the opposition. So unlike Cuba or Bolivia, it didn't simply just side 100% with the Chavista government. It said, we're going to, we're not going to recognize the opposition, but we're going to, try to negotiate between the two of you. Increasingly, Mexico is actually becoming more and more a kind of voice for, I wouldn't call it anti-imperialism because it's not as explicit as someone like Evo Morales, but of a voice of strong non-intervention in the region. And I say that because Andrés Manuel López Obrador is actually afraid of a coup in Mexico. Kirchner, who is now the vice president-elect of Argentina, the former president, she actually just tweeted that the new strategy of the right wing in the region is basically just to declare themselves interim president and to ignore all democratic processes and impose their will on the population. So there are leaders who, like Kirchner and AMLO, a few years ago were not, they were kind of like Bernie Sanders figures who kind of avoided international politics and focused on domestic politics and talked about neoliberalism, but didn't talk about empire. Increasingly, they're moving to the left because I think they've realized that as this Operation Condor 2.0 continues to grow, that even their own center-left social democratic elected governments are also being threatened. But regionally, even though the pink tide has been beaten back, I actually think, not to be too optimistic, but to be cautiously optimistic, an optimism of the will, if you will. I think that we've actually moved beyond the lowest point. The lowest point might have been last year or the beginning of this year. I actually think things are picking up again. And the coup in Bolivia, as awful as it is, might further move some of these other leaders in the region to the left and make them even more wary of the possibilities of U.S. intervention and of right-wing collusion in the region.
So I'd like to just take your optimism of the will and slide in one last pessimism of the intellect question, if I could, before we wrap up here. And that's about constitutional term limits. So somebody who we've been seeing get a lot of free airtime in the wake of this coup is Pablo Solón, who is the former UN ambassador to Morales' government. And from what I can tell, a lot of the talking points that Solón is putting forward are pure hogwash. But there is one interesting point that I think is at least worth discussing, which is that Solón is pointing to the 2016 referendum, which resulted in a no vote to remove constitutional term limits, thereby allowing Morales to run for a fourth consecutive term in office. So this constitutional reform referendum came back no, albeit by very narrow margins. It's worth mentioning.
51-49.
Yeah, exactly. The narrowest possible margins. And then that vote was ultimately ignored when he came back to run for another term in office. So my question for you was this in any respect a bad look or a misstep by Morales, or is it purely kind of being puffed up, manipulated by international press?
I think Evo was, it's clear that he wasn't confident in finding a good leader to succeed him. And I'm not blaming the Bolivian people for that. It's simply that governing is really difficult. And if we look at the situation in some of the neighboring countries and the experience they had, I think he was afraid that Bolivia could be next. Specifically, I'm referring to Ecuador, where Rafael Correa ended his term constitutionally. And then he said, you all should vote for Lenin Moreno, who was his vice president. And Moreno ran in the same party and called himself a socialist. He ran on the campaign using his first name, Lenin, and he's named after Vladimir Lenin. And what happened? He won the election and immediately betrayed what they called the citizens' revolution in Ecuador, immediately began privatizing everything. It's not necessarily to say that Evo didn't make mistakes or he was perfect, but I think his response is understandable because I think he was afraid that even if there were other potential leaders in the MAS party, I don't think he had enough confidence that his successor would be able to continue the revolution apace and might not, maybe not betray it, but also might not be able to preserve it from the opposition eventually winning power.
Well, I mean, it's worth noting that Angela Merkel has been in power longer than Evo was, and no one's calling for a fucking fascist coup against her.
Or Boris Johnson,
the
who
AFD
didn't even
is.
win an election at all.
Yeah.
Can we call for a coup against Justin Trudeau, you guys?
Sure. Apparently, these days, all you need to do is declare yourself leader. And
Hey, any intelligence services listening, I do not endorse a coup against Justin Trudeau. That's them.
no, we're not. There's no need for it. He'll disappear one day. It doesn't matter. We'll have the Conservatives in somehow. I don't know. Pretty soon, if anything.
Well,
Does Stephen Harper have a kid?
Ben, that was an absolutely fantastic discussion. Thank you so much for being on the show. We really appreciate it. That was a great chat, and you are clearly very knowledgeable on the subject. And if you ever want to be back on the show, doors open.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, thanks for having me. I'm always more than happy to rant about socialism. So thanks, guys. You're all doing good work, and keep it up.
Hey, you too. And just to remind our listeners again, check out thegrayzone.com. That's gray with an A. To check out some of more of Ben Norton's reporting. I assume you'll be continuing to cover the ongoing issue in Bolivia, and we look forward to more updates. Hopefully, if we're lucky, this will be kind of a similar situation to the 2002 coup in Venezuela, where Evo will march back into La Paz and take back the presidency. But only time will tell.
We'll link those articles in the show notes as well. So that our listeners can easily track them down.
All right. Well, Ben, thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day.
You too. Thanks to you all, and keep up the good work.
Thanks, man. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
So that was our interview with Ben Norton. We will link to his articles on the Bolivian coup in the show notes. We encourage listeners to check it out and keep an eye on the ongoing slow motion disaster that is unfolding in Bolivia. Big ups to my boy Evo. I hope you're well. I hope that Lopez Obrador is treating you well and feeding you well. I'm sure he is. So listeners, thanks for tuning in. Please do follow us on Twitter. If you want to buy us a beer, you can support us on Patreon. Big ups to our patrons. Thank you so much for your ongoing support. I recently posted a brand new premium episode of our readings of the New Agora. So if you are a patron, please do enjoy that. And we will see you next time. Thanks for tuning in.
Bye.
Good night.
And we'll see how long it takes
Good
for
morning.
Jagmeet to
Good afternoon.
tell us about the Bolivian coup.